Onassis Foundation.
Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello?
Hello, could I please speak with Baz Dreisinger?
This is she.
Baz, it's such a pleasure to have you on the phone. I'm so happy that you can be a part of the Quarantine Tapes. Thank you so much for taking this call. How are you today?
My pleasure. Is that an existential question? How are you today?
It can be. Well, it's an interesting answer you give me. It's as if this kind of question that we ask each other all the time has taken on perhaps a different meaning at this moment.
Absolutely. I now have taken to asking people not how are they doing, but how are you right now in this moment? Because this is also moment to moment and second to second. So I'm not asking people about the larger state of how they are, but rather in this second, in this passing moment, where are you emotionally?
Well, you just gave me my question. Answer your own question. It's an old technique, but you phrased it perfectly. So, how is Baz Dreisinger in this very moment as I speak with her for the Quarantine Tapes?
I am steady and inspired and strangely optimistic.
So let's take each element there. Strangely inspired. Why?
Strangely optimistic.
Strangely optimistic. Inspired. Why inspired? Inspired by what? And optimistic. Why?
Well, I mean, I am inspired because I have to be. This is a moment to act. This is a moment to do, especially given the work that I do in the space of global justice. And it's not a moment to sit back, but rather to do and to use this opening as an opportunity and turn the crisis into an opportunity and ensure that it doesn't go to waste. And I think that's true in all systems and structures right now, which are being destroyed with the potential to be built again. But it's particularly true in the space of criminal justice. And so I feel inspired by that. I also, some of the projects that I've been working on in the context of quarantine are artistic ones, and I wear a lot of hats, and it's been exciting to be able to, and it's also been life affirming to return to the artistic pursuit in this moment. And I feel really inspired by them, a series of short film projects and other activist art projects that I'm working on. And I think the strangely optimistic is one that I haven't quite figured out. I think that my optimism, I'm generally an optimist, and I in my book, I say that optimism is a justice worker's imperative. In order to do this work, you have to maintain optimism that things can be better and that there are great people capable of making them better. But so I generally walk around as an optimist. But I think in this time, I almost think of it as like when you get sick, when you have an infection, your body produces extra cells to kill the infection, your body goes into overdrive. Well, I think emotionally, my spirit has gone into overdrive with optimism in the face of the horror of all of this. And so I wake up with extra doses of it that sometimes strike me as odd, but I'm not really going to question them too much because they're serving me well.
You know, there's what you said about optimism reminds me of a line I so much like quoting of Chomsky, where he says, optimism is a strategy for making a better future, because unless you believe that the future can be better, you are unlikely to step up and take responsibility for making it so.
Absolutely. I love that. and I exist in that space generally, and I'm existing in it even more so now.
It has heightened your optimism towards action. For the benefit of our listeners today, maybe you could describe a little bit the work you have done, and then I have a series of queries for you. But I think it would be interesting for our listeners to get to know Baz Dreisinger.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned earlier, I wear a lot of hats. I am a professor based at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, although I am technically not a criminologist or a criminal justice professor. My doctorate is in literature and African American studies, but I tend to teach humanities through criminal justice through the lens of the humanities. I am an activist and in the domain of criminal justice reform. I founded a program at John Jay called the Prison to College Pipeline program, which is a university program inside prison that also works as a reentry and reintegration program. I'm a writer. I've written 2 books. The last one was Incarceration Nations, and it's about a journey to justice in prisons around the world. So it was a journey through 9 countries' prison systems. And since then, I've led to the birth of the Incarceration Nations Network, which is my current focus, and that is a global network and coalition of justice reimaginers all around the world. And we've got a number of projects under that heading, including a series of short film projects, an art installation, some research components, and we're all about essentially elevating innovative practice and radical imagination is our tagline. And we're all about radically reimagining, rethinking the way that we do justice, not just in the U.S., but globally speaking.
But the way we rethink is so connected to something I'd like to talk to you about, which is the way we talk and the way we use language to describe the reality of this moment, the reality of what happens in prisons. How we describe things affects tremendously the outcome we are seeking. And you've thought a lot about language, and I think you perhaps share a certain discomfort, to put it lightly, with the language that is being used at this moment to describe this moment, for instance, as a war, to use the metaphor of war, or to use euphemistic terminology such as social distancing or flattening the curve. What do you hear when you hear these phrases, and how could we maybe reconfigure the way we talk about this moment?
I hear numbness when I hear those phrases. I hear compliance and authoritarianism and totalitarianism and other kinds of dangerous things. I am attuned to language always. I'm an English professor, and I think quite a lot about language. In this moment, I've been reading a lot of poetry because I'm so enamored with the force of economical language in short poems. And I think, and this piece that I wrote about the language of coronavirus, I called it Corona Vocab, says exactly that, which is that we are using language that is not allowing us the full force of the trauma that we are experiencing, and trying to, in some ways, numb the population to what's really going on, and by talking about social distancing instead of loneliness, isolation. And that was, and especially around this language of the war on the virus. And for me, that harkened back to another war on vocabulary that I and other advocates are very critical of, and that's the war on drugs. Right. Which has never been won and never will be won, because drugs cannot be met, or issues of substance abuse and issues related to drug use cannot be won via an aggressive war. They're a public health issue. They're not something you could take on with tanks and battalions. And so when I started hearing the language of war again and again, certainly by our president or the man in our White House, but also by other leaders around the world, it just immediately harkened back to the danger of trying to address something that is about public health with this language of battle. And our tendency, especially in this country, and the UK followed suit, Boris Johnson did the same thing, our tendency to just want to turn everything into a war and an aggressive attack.
A war and an invisible enemy.
Yes, yes.
Which, when I heard an invisible enemy, I was reminded through the reading of literature many years back of books I read by, let's say, Céline, who spoke about Jews as being invisible microbes that could enter any system and you wouldn't know it, and they needed to be eradicated. Very strong parallel to be making, but it brought out perhaps a real fear that the language we're using is a way of demonizing certain groups.
It absolutely is. And I think I was also struck by how quickly and almost surreptitiously this new corona vocab entered our lives and took over our lives. And so that everyone was just kind of falling lockstep. And in this moment where there's so much anxiety around authoritarian leaders, and we have to watch the language that we're using. We have to watch the language that we're adopting from them, and just, again, falling right into compliance with. Compliance is another corona vocab. I also think that there is a lot of language. We talk about lockdowns, a lot of language, again, that's aggressive, but language of the criminal justice system. To call what we're experiencing a lockdown is an insult to the people who are truly experiencing lockdowns at this moment in decrepit cells all around the world for 23 hours a day.
Talk to me about them at this moment and what you know. I mean, given the extraordinary work you've done in so many different countries, and it's not as though you've only studied them, but you've gone to the places where people are locked down for real. What's happening now that you can relay?
Well, mostly disaster, certainly in this country. We are not releasing enough people. We have the world's largest prison population, of course, and we know that prisons are at the center of this epidemic. They're contained spaces where people who are especially vulnerable to the virus cannot social distance and so on, don't have access to PPE, hand sanitizer. And so what we're watching unfold pretty much on a global level is a public health crisis. And in many respects, prisons have always been a public health crisis. We've been screaming about that for some time, those of us who are activists. And now it's being recognized, okay, they are literally a public health crisis, not only for those who are incarcerated inside them, but also the staff and the prison officers who are coming out into the world. And so it's impossible to stem the infection outside without dealing with it inside. And it's actually the most powerful statement about how when we think we're incarcerating people and just getting rid of them, in essence, on some sort of a modern day version of a leper colony, we're not actually doing that because we are still tied to them. We are all in this together, right? So it's impossible to just think about having it contained in that one prison. It's going to come back out here and then re-enter. And so there have been there are tens of thousands of cases already in various states. There are states like Ohio where certain prisons have up to 80% of the prison has been infected. I mean, these numbers are staggering. In other countries, the numbers are rising daily. It's a lot harder to have a tally in many countries, as it's true on the outside of prisons in many countries because of testing availability. But I can say that the beautiful thing is that people have sprung into action, and people, I mean, Incarceration Nations network partners all around the world. We had a call yesterday with about 20 of them, everywhere from India to Australia to the UK, and they're demanding that people be released in this moment. They're demanding that technology, that systems move into the 21st century almost overnight by moving court proceedings and other kinds of hearings to Zoom and Skype and the like. And so there's there's a tremendous push, and it's estimated that more than 300,000 people have been or are scheduled to be released from prisons globally. And that's why I say actually that it's this moment of opportunity. It's a moment of trauma and terror and crisis and loss. But it's also this moment to say, okay, things that we never thought possible are suddenly becoming possible, like Turkey releasing mass amounts of people from prison. So what do we do about it? And how do we ensure that this isn't just some blip on the screen of history, but rather the start of something genuinely new?
How do we ensure that it isn't just a moment, and that when this pandemic does also pass, whatever that might mean and however that may happen, how do we ensure that we don't go back, perhaps, to what passes for normal?
Well, I wish I had the answer to that in the larger existential sense, because
please do. Baz.
Yeah, I wish I did.
Try.
I mean, unfortunately, that's a realm that I'm not optimistic about in the general sense. I think it's going to be a scenario like, sometimes when you're really, really sick, you in that moment, make all kinds of vows with whether you believe in God or the universe, whatever it is, and you make all these agreements, just get me better and I will never, ever, do this again.
Sure.
And then you get better, and it's impossible to tap into that feeling of how sick you were after you're better. So I sort of feel like in the general space, that is, if we ever get better, quote unquote, people will fall back into ways. There'll be incremental change made, but not radical. However, in the criminal justice space, I do think that one way to go about this, we are going to spread messaging worldwide about what happened, how it was better in this moment, that you can release these people and the sky will not fall down, that these kinds of measures can be taken and you can move into the 21st century in certain progressive respects, and look, nothing happened. There wasn't a massive crime outbreak. And so the more that we can push that message out to the general public and to policymakers and target both of those, the more that this can be part of a lasting response. And so those are the efforts that I'm engaged in. And I think art and media is one way to push that messaging. And we actually this week debuted, we have an art installation, and by we I mean INN and the artist Hank Willis Thomas, who's an incredible artist and dear friend. We have this installation called The Writing on the Wall, made from writing by people in prison around the world that I've collected over the years. Again, the importance of the written word and language at this moment. A lot of them are poems and other kinds of really beautiful pieces of writing. So we debuted on the Highline Park in New York City in November, and we were supposed to be taking it on tour around the U.S. and then globally. It was a physical, sort of resembling cells, but you could spend hours in there just reading these words of people who are locked away. And we figured out a way to project it, to turn it into a massive projection on buildings, and with a focus on some of these poems that deal with loss and trauma and isolation and pain, and also with some writing written by people who are currently incarcerated about COVID inside the prisons at this moment.
How extraordinary, how extraordinary. So you're taking what is written inside in a real lockdown outside for people to see.
Exactly. And we launched it, we projected it on walls in New York City on Sunday night. We did it live on social media, on Instagram, and we projected it on a wall adjacent to the Brooklyn Bridge, on the New York City courts in Lower Manhattan, and on Manhattan Detention Complex, the jail in Lower Manhattan that's known as...
How excellent. It reminds me of a work I did many, many years ago with Jenny Holzer, projecting on the walls of the New York Public Library declassified materials. So tremendous to do it for many reasons. One of them, of course, on the library, words have a deep significance, but also because what happened, Baz, is I was standing there with Jenny in the evening, and people would stop. I mean, one could walk around New York City at that time without fear. People would stop and would ask us, could you tell me what that building is? They would notice, the library for the first time because of the projection. So I commend you on this. It's really, really tremendous.
Thank you.
I want to get to something which is, you've been interested for so long now in alternative models for dealing with crime. For instance, in Rwanda, you said, I saw what can happen when healing is the focus of a justice system as opposed to punishment and revenge and anger. How could that kind of a model be applied, do you think, in the US? And I'm thinking both about restitution and reparation.
Well, the reality is it already is.
Okay.
It's just, it's about thinking about how to expand and support the programs that exist. There are restorative justice programs operating throughout this country. Some of them only for young people and for what people tend to think of as minor or smaller offenses. But some of them are operating in scenarios that involve grave acts of harm and violence. Common Justice is an organization here in New York that does that kind of work and is one of our INN partners. I recently visited a restorative justice program in Peru, a national restorative justice program in Peru. There's also a national restorative justice program in Costa Rica and in Washington, D.C. And in these programs, what happens is that when somebody commits an act of harm, instead of just simply locking them up or giving them some sort of prison-related sentence or probation or whatever it is, they're forced to reckon with what they've done, engage with the person that they may have harmed, and determine a system of restitution. And these have, and I'm generalizing, but in a general sense, restorative justice programs have been shown to be far more satisfying to the survivor of harm than the traditional criminal justice system, and far more effective in ensuring that these acts of harm don't happen again.
Right. Not eye for an eye.
Exactly. And that is what, let's call a spade a spade. An eye for an eye is the justice system we have. You harmed someone, so I'm going to teach you to not cause harm by harming you. And we thereby reproduce a cycle of harm that only comes back to damage us all.
This is on an individual level, but obviously issues pertaining to restitution and reparation happen on a national and international level. And I'm thinking particularly of the extraordinary moments I've had with Brian Stevenson, where he has spoken about the different ways in which the crimes of the past have been reckoned or not reckoned with in the United States, as opposed, in his example, in Germany. And I'm wondering if this is something that you've addressed also.
Yeah, I think quite a lot about that, given the time that I spent in Rwanda and thinking about how they acknowledge the genocide and continue to acknowledge the genocide and center it in the heart of their national narrative. I think about time I spent in Chile and how the Pinochet dictatorship is memorialized, and the disappearances of that regime, and in also similarly in Argentina, but how much is not spoken about. And one of my other homes is South Africa, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, of course, is one of the most famous examples of a public reckoning with great evil that is generally now seen as not very successful. So I tend to think of it in summary a bit. I put South Africa was sort of all emotion with no action. There were no reparative acts taken, and they were supposed to be, but no one got reparations. But there was a great outpouring of emotion. It was a cleansing of sorts. And then when I look at Chile, there was actually a very organized system of reparations. It was quite mathematical, but there was never really a public outcrying of emotion. There wasn't that public cleansing that happened, and in fact, to this day, it's almost not talked about. And whereas Rwanda struck me as a fairly good compromise of those two things, and on the emotional register, a cleansing and an acknowledgement, and also to a great degree, a system, an avenue of reparations and repair.
And here in the U.S.?
Absolute lack of reckoning. And of course, Brian Stevenson's work is a brilliant effort to address that. And the memorial is tremendous in that regard. But there needs to be, I mean, I've often thought we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission right in the Grand Canyon.
You know, when I think of restitution, I think of one moment in an interview I held at the New York Public Library with Edmund de Waal, who wrote an extraordinary book called The Hare with Amber Eyes, where I told him about a trip I had taken with my father to Vienna. My parents left Vienna just in time and spent the war years in Haiti. There was a very small Jewish community in Haiti. And I told him of a trip I took to Vienna where my father indicated with his index finger certain buildings that he knew that no longer existed. And after a while, I said to my father that I felt rather low. Maybe I'm sure I didn't use the word depressed in those years, but something of that sort. And he said, no, you're wrong. That's not how I feel. I mean, not you're wrong, but that's not how I feel. I'm here to tell you the story. And in a way, telling the story was a way of keeping the memory alive. And Edmund de Waal responded to that and saying, it's a matter of restitution. We give people back our memory one story at a time. And how important it is that these stories you are gathering are a way of giving a voice to people who often don't have a voice. And I'm interested in another example. You spoke about Rwanda, but you've also concentrated some of your efforts on Norway, where you say their prison staff is trained in philosophy, psychology, law, and social work, not criminal justice and not defense and military tactics. And I'd love you to comment on that and tell me if you think by training people in this way, the outcome is different.
Absolutely, the outcome is different. I still remember my visit to the Norwegian Prison Staff Academy like it was yesterday, and at this point it was 7 years ago. Right. I was stunned by what I saw there. I have not seen it anywhere else in the world except other Scandinavian Nordic countries, but the idea that a prison officer is, number one, a respectable job. It's thought of like an educator, like a professor. It's a very coveted job. It's a well-paid job. And so people want to do it. It's not, as in almost every other country I've been in, including here, something that no one really wants to go into, falls into. It's a critical job. If we're going to have prisons and we're going to engage in this act of corrections, then who you put in there as staff is vital. It's a bit like recognizing that a school is only as good as its teachers. And no amount of a beautiful classroom can substitute for a teacher who is not effective. And so the idea that the corrections staff that I met in the staff academy and also in the prisons that I went to in Norway are truly educators, healers. They're trained in that way. They're thinking in that way. They're permitted a level of camaraderie and closeness with the incarcerated people they work with that isn't permitted, again, almost anywhere else. That is what corrections is all about.
Baz, what a pleasure it's been to speak to you, and I hope, but I fear not that you will lose your optimism. I wanted you to comment on a line which now, unfortunately, we don't have time for you to comment on, but which I'll leave you with, which has been with me for the better part of my life. Victor Hugo once said that he who opens a school door closes a prison. And I think it's something to live by. I'm really grateful to you for having taken this call. Stay well and keep on fighting.
Thank you. Likewise, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Until soon.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.